Welcome everyone to the first Obsidian Office Hours of 2023. So with a new year, we're bringing back an old classic. We're bringing back the Obsidian Office Hours. And so I guess the first question some people might have is, why did we go from Obsidian Office Hours to Productivity Power Hour? Now we're going back. Basically, to be honest, when I first moved off of Obsidian Office Hours, I had this aspiration to do sort of a lot more productivity concepts and apps and stuff. And then I should have known better, but the productivity world is quite big. And for me, like a lot of the live streaming here is really just to share things that I'm doing in my world, some of the things that I like that work for me as far as my workflow. And so over time, the productivity power hour became a lot in terms of like things I wanted to talk about. And really, a lot of my work really does revolve around Obsidian. More importantly, like I found that this is the niche that I want to be in when it comes to this topic. As a result, we're just reining it back in because, again, productivity covers a lot of ground. And at least Obsidian Office Hours, y'all know what to expect. And again, we might talk, well, not we might, we'll definitely be talking about different productivity tools as it relates to Obsidian because, frankly, that's basically how it's been impacting my life as far as like figuring out, oh, how can this integration work with this? So you'll definitely see different productivity apps and techniques being featured as part of Obsidian Office Hours, but it will always center around our favorite note-taking app, Obsidian. Okay, so we covered why we have Obsidian Office Hours, why we're bringing it back. And as far as what you can expect, so basically, my journey with live streaming has been a bit of a challenging one in that I have a lot of people in my life who've been excellent role models in terms of what their live stream setup has been like. And at times, I don't know, how do I call it? I bit off more than I can chew, is what I'll happily admit. Because a lot of times you see the YouTube channels, people's live stream, and you're like, I can do that. I want to do that. I'd love to create content at that level. But at the same time, what I clearly realized was that one, my bandwidth for that and for creating content is well, I just don't have the same support because some of the people who run the streams that you see, and more importantly, especially some of the polished YouTube videos that you see, those are actually being done by teams. They're often not being done by a single person. And if they are being done by a single person, typically what I've found is that content creation is a large part of their day. But for me, a lot of the content I'm creating here is really just to pass on my experience and just to create a safe space so that we can talk about stuff. I can share what I'm learning about. You can learn basically from what mistakes I've made. And so I want to keep it that. So as a result, we're going to go back to the roots as far as having the weekly Obsidian Office Hour stream. So I'm going to get that back up on the website so people can see the schedule of what kind of topics we'll cover. Granted, it's Obsidian Office Hours, so live questions are always welcome. But then these will always be posted to YouTube. So I'm going to get back to basically posting a recording of the live stream with some minor editing so that some of the ums, ahs are cut out. And then more importantly, we have any silences and stuff just to streamline it a little bit. And that way people can have that as a reference going forward. And that'll allow me to then build on the other resources that I really want to get at, which is like a lot more written content resources. So like some of the tips that we talked about here on the stream, really, I really would love them as little blog posts, basically. And so those are the kind of things you can come to expect. And as I mentioned, this has been a bit of a journey. So the other thing too that I'm actually adhering to as part of my, I really don't want to call it New Year resolutions because I have opinions on that, but that can be a topic for another time. But basically going forward for my goal, my commitment to you is that the Obsidian Office Hours is basically going to go to Q1 of 2023. So we're going to make this basically a 3-month experiment going through the end of March. And you'll basically can expect to see me live every week. Some weeks may have to change if I'm like at a conference or something. So again, I'll make sure that that schedule is up live. And so if you go to benkozen.io/schedule, I'll make sure everything is updated there so you know what to expect and you know where you can find me when it comes to Obsidian questions. Said, and so with that, let's go ahead and dive right into questions and what we're here to talk about today. So the first question we have actually, so what I'm going to do here, let's go ahead and talk about our first question of the day. And so this is from Yakniv in the chat, and it's around this idea of how do you decide to write a note about something technical versus just searching it back up through documentation. And so a lot of times I think the sense I'm getting, Yakniv, here is around the idea of, because you mentioned here that it feels like rewriting docs. And when do you balance the difference between docs versus taking your own notes? So actually, that's how I think I'm going to topic this one. So I'm going to say, so let me see, let me refactor this note. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to call this docs versus, actually, did it do what I wanted to do? Hopefully it did. Docs versus note taking. All right, great, perfect. And so this then, I'll just put this as a quote because this was the exact question. And here we go. We can have this here. I'm going to jot this down. And we're going to give credit to, Yakniv here for that question. And then I'm going to actually phrase this as, actually, no, a note's fine. And it's related to Obsidian Canvas. So what you just saw me do here is one of my favorite techniques for Obsidian is that rather than having to put everything in a single document, making it hard to find, this here basically starts to allow me to connect stuff. And so the note refactor is what you saw there. And so as you can see here, we take a look at how it's connected. You can see that Obsidian Office Hour Canvas, this particular session, is connected to this docs verse note-taking question, which is nice. Anyhow, all right, so let's really cover the core of this, which is that when we think about note-taking, and especially when it comes to managing your personal knowledge management system, the biggest challenge I think people find is that they find themselves basically trying to recreate the internet, actually, which is interesting. And so let me collect my thoughts here. Okay, so the point I want to make here is that your notes are not a replacement for the internet. So in other words, I know that in the past I've made references to like your note-taking system having like building your personal search engine. But when I mention the personal search engine, it's not that you're necessarily rebuilding Google so that if you can search for any terminology, you can find the thing that and what it's defined, right? And so in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that the note-taking shouldn't actually be treated as a dictionary of sort where you're trying to figure out how something works. And so in relation to Yakniv's question here, when you're basically looking for a method, let's say you're doing coding, or to be honest, anything that you're looking on how to do, it's really tempting to find the article that you found really interesting and then try to replicate it inside of your notes. So let's take let's take an example for this, right? So what's a good example? Let's talk about, all right, the JavaScript reduced functionality. This is a very common thing. Or actually, you know what? Let me take this back because no guarantee that everyone here has JavaScript knowledge, but we can maybe let's talk about the HTML input element and the type color. This is actually something that a lot of people don't know about. And so here, if we go to input type color, HTML, all right. So so in case you didn't know, there is this input type in HTML that actually has this built-in component that allows you to basically let users select colors, and then it'll automatically do the hex value for you, which is pretty great. And so if this is something you're learning for the first time, and you're like, oh, this is really cool, there's two ways to approach this. The first of which is certainly to be like, I'm basically going to copy this entire article and I'm going to try and basically have a reference later. So the example that might be like, oh, you're like, oh, okay, this is really cool. This is like a pretty good explanation. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to open a new document. I'm going to call it input type color. That's what I'm going to call this. And then I'm going to paste this in here. And then you probably feel like, okay, this is pretty good. And then maybe you might add some metadata to be like, oh, this is who's the source of this. And so the creator for this one is MDN. So I'm just going to let the Mozilla get credit for that. And then you might gonna go, okay, and you know what? I'm going to go ahead and also put the URL here as well. So I have the original source. And so that's one way to approach it. But as Yakniv has mentioned in the question, this actually feels like you're rewriting documentation. And more importantly, actually to push it one point further, you're taking note on outdated documentation. And so my personal philosophy when it comes to the note-taking versus documentation here is the fact that really instead of trying to capture everything as if the internet might one day disappear, note-taking is really about taking what's most relevant to you. And so with input type color, there's nothing wrong if you want to quote a quick definition for yourself. If you're like, oh, it takes a prop color. And so I'll put that in quotes because for me, the quote block is a very useful delineation in note-taking, particularly with Markdown, because it tells me that it's not something that I put in my own words. In other words, I didn't write this. However, what I could find interesting though, is that I might be like, okay, so in learning how to use this, I've learned things like, okay, the value tends to be hexadecimal, right? So basically, I tend to use notes as a way to process and reflect on that information. So even though it's technically here in the definition that it's hexadecimal format, again, how many times have we read something or watched something where we understood that information, but until we took the time to process it and contextualize it, do we really start to understand it? And more importantly, be able to reflect it back to the people that we work with and when we want to share it. And so in this particular case, I think it's actually useful to know that, for example, you can actually provide a default color. So rather than, for example, let me rewind my thoughts here. Okay. So here, you're learning about a new technique to provide a default color. Again, you can see that immediately I was almost caught up to be like, oh, let me document the fact that you can provide a default color. Again, if it's not something I'm doing on a daily, this is one of those things where I can read it and be like, okay, this is cool. Can provide default color. Maybe I'll just make a note of that. Rather than amending it, can provide default color. I don't need to document how that works. I don't need to have a snippet if I don't really want to. But if I really wanted to, there's nothing stopping us from just quickly being like, okay, here we go. This is like worth just keeping in the back of my mind as something that can work. Okay, there we go. Input color. There you go. That said, though, one of the things I'm immediately starting to be curious about as I'm thinking about this concept is, okay, what else? I am curious, can I put anything other than hexadecimal? And so this is where I'm going to probably go through, look, okay, look, so there's interesting. There's all these events happening that you can associate with JavaScript, which is pretty cool. So I might just be like, has custom events in JavaScript that we can watch and listen. Whoops. Watch and listen for. All right, cool. This is great. So then, okay, so again, I don't want to document exactly what it is because at this point, again, if I'm taking a course and they're mentioning this, my goal here is not to memorize. My goal here is to start to remember what's interesting to me because this is how it starts to become sticky. And then the other thing, again, the questions that seem to come organically. So for example, one of the things I might do is currently I might create a questions section because something that's coming to mind right now is, can I specify color format? Because while hexadecimal is a common one for specifying color, for me, I actually do using HSL, or maybe I want to try something different. And so in this case, it looks, let's see, let's go down. Can we do JavaScript? Yep, initialization, color change, result. Can we do something about format? Let's see, HSL? No. Okay, so this is interesting. So as of the moment, the value only takes a hexadecimal color. I don't see anything to indicate otherwise. But as you can see here, this would basically be my rough notes on a concept for input type color. And the main thing, as always, because again, if we think that the internet is one day going to go down, I think we have a much different approach that we're going to take when it comes to saving information and stuff. But what we can do, and the way I think that's most sustainable for treating our notes in Obsidian, is to basically always document the source of where you're inspired from for these things. And then once you have that, then really this is about your ideas and your thoughts. And what's interesting about this is that over time, what you'll find is that if you're someone who likes to create content or you want to share a blog post, oftentimes these notes will serve as the bullet points for what you find most interesting and what's relevant to you. When someone's, hey, can you give me a 30-second pitch on input type color? You can basically do so because these are the things that stuck out to you. And so for me, for the moment, I'll be like, at the moment, does not a decimal is the only format available. And so quickly, I might want to go ahead and actually go input type color, specify HSL, for example. And so here we go. So you can't look, here we go. So someone here is mentioning that you can't get HSL. So we get the hex code, and then it clearly means that if we want to do any sort of conversion, that's for us to do. Okay, so that was a quick example of when you're learning about a technical concept, how you might not replicate docs, but instead focus on what is relevant to you. And then from there, you can go ahead and document that and then add the relevant docs that's important to you. The other thing to, I think, do searching it back through documentation. Okay, great. So Yagniv, hopefully that helps to clarify that scenario when it comes to writing notes. And I know that particularly with notes too, people find this challenging too when it comes to work stuff and they're thinking about like how things work. Oftentimes what I do find is that you generally contribute to the core like reference. So if everyone is using like wiki pages, that's the place where I try to keep things updated. But the moment is something that, let's say, the team doesn't think that's relevant to them, but I think is really important for me to remember as far as like how things work, I do not hesitate to create an Obsidian note because I don't want to rewrite the docs. But if the docs aren't going to be kept somewhere that I can reliably find, then this is where I find the Obsidian becomes a big part of it. And so in this particular case, input type color, for example, the fact that we've now have this question, can I specify color format? This is probably a question that might come up again later on when I'm thinking about input type color. But now I have a note here, and that will help me remember that. And more importantly, if I'm working on this in the future, then it'll allow me to be like, oh, actually things have changed, right? I can update it and whatnot. But otherwise, this process alone has been helpful for this process has been helpful for really developing concrete understanding of the main points of input type color, and so that in the future I have a better understanding of it. So anyhow, hope that was helpful. Okay, so key points on this is that, right, your notes are not a replacement for the internet. The main Purpose of notes is to process and contextualize, to make the information sticky. And so actually, I think I do want to touch on this a little bit, is because when we're taking notes, there's two really concepts here when it comes to note taking, and there's shallow note taking versus I would call it like deeper note taking. And shallow note taking is basically the copy and paste. It's like basically taking the most highest level concept and you're basically saying, "Oh, I'm gonna drop this in a document because one day I'll reference it." And there's nothing wrong with that. We've talked about that as a way to like jot down ideas. But when it comes to learning something, and I think this is where it's an important context around this question, because writing a note about something technical versus searching documentation is, in my mind, a question of acquiring information, right? You want to not only acquire that knowledge, but you ideally would also like to have some sort of mastery of it. Because if it was something as, oh, this is a cool thing, yeah, you can take a quick note, jot it down, reference it later. But since this is about knowledge and skill acquisition, this means that rather than merely just copying that information at a shallow level, you're really trying to use notes as an opportunity to really solidify how that information lives in your brain. And of course, the beauty of note taking is that over time, even if that erodes in your brain, you can come back and recontextualize and more importantly, add to it. As for example, if we start discovering bugs within events within JavaScript, right? If you think about it, like Stack Overflow and a lot of these forums are giant notepads of notes of people who are like, I had this problem. How did I fix it? And I don't know about y'all, but sometimes when you're trying to fix a problem on the internet, like using the internet as a reference, you'll find one solution. And if you happen to close that tab, sometimes the algorithm changes and you can't find the solution that actually worked for you before. And that's where I think note taking is valuable in terms of if you're like copy pasting. This is why I would say like jotting down your sources. So let's say we have multiple blog posts that we found were useful for input type color. I'd honestly just drop a list. Like I might even go as far to go here, let's go resources. And inside of resources, instead of making it a back matter now, I'm just going to say full MDN docs. And then let's actually just find if they have actually, this is a thread that's worth mentioning because this is someone that's talking about the HSL conversation. So I'm going to jot that down. So I'm going to be like, okay, Stack Overflow, HSL question. Good enough. And so that's enough to, as you can see, since I talked it through, it took a little bit longer. But if you're doing this by like in a flow state where you're just jotting stuff down, this is a great way that you can confidently say, in the future, you can come back and start your progress, resume your journey when it comes to that learning progress. Yeah. All right. That takes care of that question. But Yagni, if you have any, like, if you have any additional sort of questions or context that you want to add to that scenario, please feel free to let me know and I'm happy to dive further or take on a different example to help better illustrate that. Okay, I see here from Burgeons. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the screen name. So this is from Burgeons. And the question here is around, oh, okay, this is great. So let's see. I'm going to refactor this. I'm going to call it other to use beside, other note-taking apps I use. I'm literally just going to call it that because that's really the topic here at hand. So we're going to give credit to Burgeons here for that question. And because I've been meaning to start documenting this stuff, but it's been a little challenging. Okay, great. So for this particular question, while I could simply sit here and rattle some stuff off, I do think it's important to contextualize why Obsidian, like as much as I love it, can't solve everything. And so what I will say is Obsidian is at this point my primary note-taking app when it comes to mobile and desktop because the mobile app and desktop with the new redesign for V1 has done a really good job as far as making it quite easy to keep everything in sync and more importantly to pull things up and write things down. That said, though, it's still not great when it comes to things like collaboration. That still remains, I would say, probably Obsidian's one of Obsidian's greatest weak points in comparison with other note-taking tools where people might be expected to collaborate on a note live together, like on a Google Docs and that kind of stuff. For that purpose, when it comes to collaboration, I mentioned Google Docs and that kind of stuff. That I find really good for the lowest barrier of entry because basically Google Docs is basically a rebuild of or like a cloud version of Microsoft Office, which for those of us who are millennials or who have grown up with it and older, it's an interface that a lot of people are familiar with, so you don't have to really onboard anyone to it. And that's why I think that is incredibly useful when I'm working with someone. However, Google Docs does have its limitations when it comes to working with different types of content and how to display things. And so the other one that's been making the rounds a lot that I use as well would be Notion. And so I would say Notion is my primary collaboration note-taking app because of its flexibility in terms of like how you display things, the fact that it has different blocks, it has powerful things like databases. And so Notion, I would say, is my go-to for collaboration. So let me actually bump that up. And Google Docs really is for particularly, I would say, copy editing and quick notes. But Notion would be my go-to. That said, though, the other scenario I would say is that when it comes to Obsidian, sometimes it's still a little slow in terms of the startup, I would say, in comparison. So perhaps I'm just not as practiced yet, but compared to opening an Apple Notes or like a scratch pad that you might have on your Android device, sometimes if you don't have everything set up properly and it hasn't been synced in a while, you'll find yourself with a couple of seconds of lag between when you want to actually write the note and when you actually can write the note. And so I have little workflows right now I'm testing out with like trying to make sure everything is synced first thing in the morning. So there's less of that interruption and hopefully a better flow state. But other note taking apps that I do, even just for myself. So let's see, quick notes. So Versions has a great, is called out actually exactly that. So I still use Apple Notes actually. And I forgot, Apple Notes actually does fall into the collaboration aspect as well because I have family members who also have Apple devices. And so it's nice to be able to just quickly share things with them, the list, because some of them are not as into the productivity realm. So having them either open a Notion doc, Google Doc, it's too much. They have Apple Notes. And so for a lot of our basic usage, which is something that's quick and often discarded, then Apple Notes works actually really great. The other one that is the Draft app. So I'm going to try to see Draft app. I think this is particularly for, yeah, this is, I wonder, yeah, this is an Apple specific one, but I will add this as a resource to this particular notes for this episode. So resources. So Get Drafts is actually an app that I've been meaning to actually really take a look at for a long time because it has a lot of powerful automation things and integrations that people have been using it for. And so I'm curious in diving more into that. But if you're looking for an alternative, that's one that's worth checking out. But that said, particularly with the Apple Notes, in terms of the philosophy around when I use other notes, as you can see, a lot of it has to do with working with other people. But the other thing too is that if it's not something I'm trying to save, then Obsidian is not as useful for those scenarios. For example, if I'm like at IKEA and I want to quickly jot down a product number because I want to be able to pick it up at the shelf later on, that's something where Apple Notes might be faster because given that it's built in, the data is already like it's super quick. Like I think the time ratio on creating a note in Apple Notes, I would still say is probably still faster than Obsidian at the moment. Granted, if I can get fast enough where I can quickly add something, that'll be a different scenario. But otherwise, that's where I'm at in terms of my notes at the moment. I've really tried to pare down on other dependencies when it comes to note taking for the fact or for the reason that in the end, we know that having multiple sources of truth can be incredibly painful in terms of trying to remember where everything is. So I would say over time, as I get better at getting everything integrated, you'll be sure to hear about it in terms of like how I integrate like my Remarkable tablet or the free write. How do we get all that connected in a way that leverages the Obsidian graph, but then can leverage what's native and what works well about those platforms in those contexts. With that said, hopefully that was helpful, virgins. All right, cool. Okay, so with that, I think we have covered questions for today. And it's time for us to get into the topic at hand for this Obsidian Office Hours. With that, let's jump on into Obsidian Canvas. So, if you hadn't heard, Obsidian had a pretty big release recently with a feature that could very well be a game changer for many. So, as what I'm going to assume here is that what you do know is that Obsidian is essentially a markdown editor. So just like we've been seeing this entire time, I've been working in with text. And so while that's really great for most note taking, in the end, as we well know, information doesn't just come in single columns. Oftentimes we want to do maybe two columns, or maybe more importantly, we'd like to think a little bit more visually. And I think that's what people really like about pen and paper thinking because you can sketch anywhere, write anything, and then after that, like you can just let your brain do its thing. And so prior to this, I was using the Excalidraw. Yes. Can I just open a new Excalidraw? Create a new drawing. Boom. Okay. So here we have Excalidraw, which is an external plugin to Obsidian, which allows me to do things like create like a square here. Great. Then we have a diamond. And then from here, we can go ahead and take an arrow and connect these two. Great. And so then we can add inside of here that this is my thought. And then we can can I edit this? It looks like I can't really edit this. But then so it allows you to do somewhat of that pen and paper sketching. But it is not a native integration to Obsidian. So there were some things that were a little bit trickier to finagle around when it came to linking and that kind of stuff. But that said, to be clear, the Excalidraw plugin for Obsidian is phenomenal. And so mad props to the plugin author for creating this and just letting people integrate with Excalidraw, which I guess let's shout out to Excalidraw, which is its, oh, let me see, library. Oh, this is one comment I do have about web apps. I like the fact that it's easy for us to dive right into our logged in state, but sometimes I just want to see our homepage. And clearly now I'm even having trouble seeing that. Yeah, it's just, there you go. Can I log out? Can I log out so you can see? There we go. Can I just excalidraw.com? It's still bringing me back to here. That's frustrating. Okay, anyways, Excalidraw is a web app. It's a service, and it's a service that's worked as on its own for a really long time. So it's really cool that there's this native integration in Obsidian for it so that we can have a plugin and then it works within it and then you can go back and forth between the two. That part is phenomenal. However, the Obsidian team clearly had some ideas on their own as far as like ways to also help those who might not be, let's say, in the Excalidraw ecosystem and maybe wanted a more Obsidian custom solution. And so, introducing Obsidian Canvas. And so I think the easiest way to demo this is to just open a canvas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the command palette and I'm going to create a new canvas here with the command create new canvas. And so as you can see here, it looks like it's a brand new tab. If I open a new tab right now for new note, it looks fairly the same. But what's different here is that this here is basically a blank canvas for you to use. And so you can see here that I can scroll, I can move, so I can drag it around because what we get inside of here now is the ability to do visual thinking natively in Obsidian. So let's start something with really simple. Let's talk about my Epic Notes course, right? So let's think, so I'm going to create a card here that's just Epic Notes. And so with this, I can actually start being like, okay, what other topics do I want to cover in Epic Notes? And so let's take a look at that actually side by side. So we take my Open Notes course here on the side, which, by the way, is very much a work in progress. So everything you see here is just thoughts that's murmuring around, but certainly something that I'm basically working on developing. Okay, so here I have a bunch of stuff, but what you'll notice here is that what I've done is I've just created a bullet list of random things. And more importantly, it's hard to actually detect the relationship between things when you want to start organizing things in a way that might make sense. Because in my experience, when it comes to teaching things, a lot of times things are related on multiple fronts, and it's difficult to represent that in the traditional text view, which is a single column layout. So in this particular case, we can just add some more stuff, right? Let's just call it like Obsidian Graph. Obsidian Graph as a concept, I think, is often underutilized, partially because I think it's difficult to wrap your head around. But I think if I could basically distill some best practices for how to leverage it, I think people might find it really useful in terms of an automatic visual way of looking at your notes. And so we can see here, let's talk about query. Query is important. And so whoops, there we go. We have query. And then more importantly, we actually have, now that Canvas is a thing, that really should be its own thing, right? And so what's cool about this now is that you have these cards that we're doing visually. So let me actually move this over a little bit because we want to focus here. Is that you want to create relationships. And so what you can do is you'll notice the blue circle here. It's just as simple as just dragging it over. Being like, yep, that's on graph, that goes to query. And so what's cool about this too is that we can start thinking like, actually, you know what, though, this is around the concept of visual thinking when it comes to grouping things. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do visual thinking because this is a different type of approach to notes, right? And so if we think about it as like a paradigm, maybe that's what I'll do. I will connect this one, and I'm going to call this a paradigm of visual thinking. And then what we can do here, let me open that up. Then let me resize this, and then I'll make paradigms green. All right, so this is one way of thinking about it. And then these concepts like Obsidian Graph, really, actually, they're subsumed under it if we think about it. And then similarly with Canvas, these are subsumed underneath here. As you can see here, what's nice about this is we're getting a really organic way of starting to think about our ideas and starting to visualize those relationships in a way that I know that one of the biggest criticisms when it comes to the graph is that, for example, if we take a look at here, people want to be able to do specific things with the graph. So while we can certainly come inside of here, create groups, display some colors to visualize it a little bit, it is a little bit programmatic in terms of filling out a form to be like, but what if I want like this node thing to sit in this particular spot? As you can notice, I can't do that because when I pull it, it'll just go and then bounce right back because here it's just a programmatic graph that's like showing the nodes and how things are connected. But with something like this, we can actually start really basically creating like the mind, what do they call it? The mind palace, right? That's a memory technique if you haven't heard of it, where if you imagine like your living area, you can store information by walking through the space and being like, oh, okay, here I'm in the kitchen. I'm going to store this information in this cabinet. And so some people have these really elaborate mind palaces when it comes to a memory technique. And so I know that I think one of the best visualizations I've seen of the memory palace was done on the TV show Sherlock, which if you haven't checked out, I'm going to just make a reference of it because Sherlock is awesome. So the Sherlock TV show, I'll actually mention the, let me see, a memory palace episode. So I'll actually try to I'll make sure to add the specific episode that I'm referring to here. And anyhow, so the cool thing about this now is that you're probably thinking, okay, so this is cool, but then you're probably thinking, what about like my notes? Because if we think about what's actually in here, so actually let me do this. This is my Epic Notes canvas. So I'm gonna do this like that. Great. Obsidian is about linking notes. And while it's one thing to whiteboard concepts, that it in itself is not novel at all. Many apps have been created that can do this. Now, what's cool about this, though, I will say, is that if we go and take a look, let me open this inside of Finder, and let me open up my VS Code because I want to show you actually what's underneath here. So if let me just close all this other stuff for distraction. There we go. And then, great. All right. Boom. Okay. What you notice inside of here is that while it doesn't allow, so how do I do this? Okay. So the important thing to understand here is that one of the biggest advantages of Obsidian is the fact that you own your data. And when you own your data, particularly with other text files, like for example, if we go ahead and take a look at this Obsidian Office Hours that we see right here, let me go ahead and open this in Finder, and then let me drop this also in VS Code. If I can find, there it is. Okay. What you see here is that it's just plain text, right? There's no encoded syntax that makes it difficult to read. If we lost access to Obsidian, we could understand all of this still, and it'd be fairly easy to parse. On the other hand, with something like a visual representation, how do you do this? And so what's nice about this is while this is not necessarily, how do I say this? This is not immediately comprehensible to like someone who's not used to looking at data formatted, like sort of computer data structures. Once you get the hang of what it is, you can actually see that, okay, look, what are nodes? Nodes are the different cards that we have. And you can see they each have different IDs, which is attached to this, which is consistent, right? And so you can see here, you can actually see what those nodes are. Oh yeah, it's Epic Nodes. Epic Nodes is connected to what? So it's connected to this node, which is right here, which comes here is what? Query. And so because your data gets represented this way, if you really wanted to, you could actually rebuild this view inside of your own web app. I'm assuming some programming skills, of course, in this case. But what's nice about it is that your data still is in like basically accessible to you, rather than being in some proprietary format where unless you have their algorithm where they happen to convert things to a certain way, you can actually see the positions too as well. Here's the X position, here's the Y position, here's the width, here's the height, and here are things like, I think one of them is green, right? So we can see paradigm, which is paradigm. Oh, wait, here, paradigm, look. Oh, this is color 4. Now this would be lost. This data would be lost. So I'm actually a little surprised here that it's color 4. If I were to make a request for the team and you happen to hear this, it would be nice if the canvas was actually, when you're choosing the color here, that you're actually choosing like the data being stored would be the hexadecimal at the bare minimum. Because it looks like these are fixed colors. So that would be nice so that in the future, it would be nice to be able to just keep the stylings the same, is how I'll put it. But what's nice too, though, however, let's take a look though. Now that I've said that, if we actually specify a specific shade of green, let's say we want more of a lime green color, and we change that, and we take a look, actually, you'll notice that it does change to the hexadecimal. So this is consistent with their idea of keeping it open. It's just to me that for the prefix colors, we're actually referencing them by what I'm assuming is an enumerable, which is basically just a reference. So the number 4 represents this green. So I would imagine it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's how they know that the 4 represents that. But if they could just translate that automatically to the hexadecimal, hexadecimal code, that would be, I think, perfect. That said, though, again, the data is actually really easy to access and understand. That said, though, we can all then talk about really what makes this exciting is that at the end of the day, you can integrate notes into this. So in the terms of the topic of the canvas, I actually do have an Obsidian Canvas note over here. And you'll notice that it's empty right now because I haven't had the chance to really dive deep as far as all the tips and tricks on how I want to do this. Now, remember, actually, funny enough, this relates back to the earlier question we had in this session, which is around the idea of replicating documentation. And what I don't want to do is I don't want to take the Obsidian docs and then just drop it in here. Because I certainly could. I could write down how you do certain things, how you group certain things. But for me, what I will end up doing, in fact, let's do this live because we're practicing this. This is the actual official docs for the Obsidian Canvas that I've found so far. So actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go ahead and actually create a resources because I imagine there's going to be other people with videos and blog posts that I'm going to want to reference. And then from that point on, I'll just create a notes section. And then there we can basically, I'll keep track of the tips and tricks that I think were relevant to me that I want to share with people. This is where the canvas is useful. Okay, so then in this particular case, rather than just being this note here, because what you want to do is connect it directly, what we can do is I'm going to go ahead and for now, I'm just going to delete this. And we can actually add a note directly from the vault. And so you can see here, when I've done this, what's really cool is that it's actually a direct embed. That is one option for you. So now if we go and take a look at this and go back to, actually, let's split this up and take this out. Then we'd be like, you can embed Obsidian notes directly inside of the canvas. And that is pretty darn cool. Look at that. And then so more importantly, I need to get rid of this syntax that I have where I duplicate the note title because now we have, with the new design, you have the note title at the top. But check this out. That is cool. Let me see. If I collapse stuff, would that reflect? Okay, so collapsing is specific to, so it does embed everything directly. It looks like you can't really hide anything at the moment. So actually, now that I mentioned that, let's actually add that as a question. Can you hide things from? And so I'm thinking about callout specifically. That's the one that comes to mind. But again, that's for my experimentation. We're not going to sit here and do that just yet because I do want to make sure we spend this time covering what makes this exciting. And so that said, though, there may be some of you who may be thinking, I'm certainly thinking, okay, but what if I don't want to embed the note directly because I still want to keep it minimal so that I can understand where everything is. So if we go ahead and, oh, check this out. I did this by accident. But if you double click on the note, you can actually just edit it directly. You can edit notes directly within the canvas view. Oh man, that is actually pretty phenomenal that those things can be embedded. So that's pretty darn cool. But then let's see. So what if I don't want the embedded view? What if I wanted to just drop it, but I wanted to keep it related? Because actually, here's a good check real quick. If you drop in the note and you relate it here, if I'm not mistaken, let me open this up. Can we open this up in a new window? How do I do that? Right click. Oh, narrow to section. Oh, you can narrow. Oh, snap. That's cool. I didn't realize you could do that. No heading. Okay, see, that's pretty cool. I'm going to drop that in immediately. You can... Okay, so this is something that's worth noting as you're watching me do this. So you can narrow the view. So this relates to the hiding part. You can narrow views. That's cool to only show what's relevant via headings. Okay, that is super, super awesome. Because you can see here, I got a lot going on in here. And it might not really need an... Okay, oh cool. The front matter is automatically hidden. That's pretty neat. All right, very cool. But what if I want to open in a new window? Oh, window? No, that's a little too much. Let me just open a new tab. Okay, great. Now, if we take a look at this relationship, oh, this is interesting. So Obsidian Canvas does not have a direct relationship inside of to the Epic Notes canvas, which you would expect. I'm a little surprised. So that is a question worth why? Why does the canvas not appear on the graph? Now, what's important to remember though is at the time of this recording, this is what I'm seeing. For all I know, it's very possible there is some filter that allows me to show canvases, or more importantly, it could be something that I'm doing wrong. But as far as like in my intuitive like leap, I'm currently not seeing the canvas, even though I have technically embedded it in here. So that said, what if, on the other hand, I do something different? I have a note card here, and inside of here, I'll actually link to the Obsidian Canvas like this. So this here now is more of what we were talking about before, where you want this simple view where the note has been related, but you don't necessarily want it to be a full embed. Let's say I'm just going to call this Canvas using the alias technique, and there you go. Now it just says Canvas. But it looks like the canvas is still not creating any relationships. So this is an interesting observation here because it does bring into question whether or not the canvases are meant as like a separate graph. Like they're not meant to clog the Obsidian graph that's natively doing the relationships. That said, though, that still is rather surprising because if that were the case, your canvas is still a form of your mental models. No different than if we were to turn this into a list form and just jot stuff down in embed. So this really does beg the question here. This one is actually pretty darn important, and it's something I will want to investigate. Okay, anyhow, that said, what I really have liked when using this is you can see here we have the ability to change things like color. But what's nice about this too is that you can actually start to even add relationships if you're like, if you like graphs, right? Follow this path. And that's nice. More importantly, you can see here that normally, like if you want to create a two-way relationship too, let's say that query and Epic Notes want to go back to back, you could do it like this, and that's what some do. But what you can do instead actually is you can just drag the query back up and it'll create a double-headed arrow, which is pretty darn great. I would say though, it probably is a little bit tricky in that, as you saw earlier, if you want to delete the bottom arrow, like you only want it to go up and not down, it seems like you have to, yeah, it seems like the arrows just layer on each other, which I do think probably has room for improvement then, because most diagramming softwares, when it comes to the arrows, basically you have a chance to choose whether or not it goes back and forth. So yeah, that could be a UX improvement on that regard. But again, for me, I actually do being able to just be like, this is the relationship down, this is the relationship up, and then it's just visualized that way. And then if I really need two different branches for whatever reason, then I can basically do so accordingly. Okay, so what else do I want to highlight? So we can zoom to selection. See, that's like a good little UX thing that they've done so that we can go ahead and drop over without having to basically slide the pane over manually. So I like that a lot. That they've done a really good job. And that's, look at this. The fact that when you zoom out, you get this really cool view. Oh my gosh, this is great. Now, the other thing too that I think the final thing that I want to mention is that when it comes to Obsidian Canvas, this thing can be exported. I know that we've talked about like what is visualized as a text format, but what you can do is if we go ahead, let me see if I can do this export as image right here, this command. Or for those of us who like using menus, it's up here in the upper right, and then it should be able to say, wait, it should be here. Oh yeah, export as image right there. Okay, so what's cool about this is you get the ability to basically choose what exactly you want to export. So if we can add logo. Oh, privacy mode, obscure any text on canvas. Dang. Oh, that's pretty darn cool. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this right now. So I'll do Epic Notes PNG. It's rendering that. Let me reveal that, and then let me open this up. And then check this out. This is cool. Now, of course, there's a little bit of a Obsidian logo to show you where you made it. But it looks gorgeous, which is amazing. But what's also cool though is that normally you might do the whole thing, but let's say you really wanted to focus on a specific area. Like we want to focus on this particular, let's say like these three right here. Let's go ahead and rearrange this. 1, 2, and actually I'm going to go ahead and delete that so we can just make it a clean line. Let's say we want to focus on this aspect of the graph. So what I can do is I can move it over here, And then once we do this, what we can do, believe it or not, is we can once again export, but what we can do is just whatever's in the viewport. And so once again, we can save that, and then we'll just call this Epic Notes 2. I'll review that in Finder. And what you see here is, whoops. Oh, interesting. This now only catches the visual thinking and Epic Notes. It did not capture the query. Why is that? That actually is not, at least in my mind, that's not expected behavior. The zoom is correct. Yep. Is it because I zoomed by default? That's surprising. If I do viewport, oh, okay, that zoom is gone. Privacy mode, export, save. Epic Notes 3, reveal in Finder. Huh, fascinating. So why is it doing that? That's an okay, so that's another question. Like, why does viewport not capture what's seen on the screen? Now, it's possible, actually, now that I think about it, what if it is because my zoom level is weird? Because I do have the Obsidian zoomed actually by default to make the menus bigger for everyone here on the live stream. So let's go ahead and try this again. Export image. This time we do the viewport only. Once again, we'll do it like this. This time it'll be Epic Notes 4. And then we can just open up Epic Notes 4. Okay, that looks better. Okay, interesting. So the zoom impacted what we saw. Okay, so that's something that's worth noting here. And once again, to bring it all back to what we've been talking about today, documentation is for when things are official, and that's going to be monitored. But as you run into issues, notes are perfect for that personalized learning experience because, frankly, if I did this before, I'm probably going to accidentally do it again. And so it's nice to just have these things captured because eventually what I'd like to do is when I'm teaching or talking about Obsidian Canvas, that some of these best practices or common issues can be just documented as blog posts. And then, sure, if eventually they make it into Obsidian documentation, that's wonderful. But then that unique piece of information has really lived out its full life cycle as far as being useful for people and for myself as well. And so it looks like a manual zoom on Obsidian impacts viewport capture. So that seems to be the key thing there. But otherwise, I am curious about that one functionality that we saw, which is if we do export as image and then we do privacy mode and we save this, I'm actually curious what this looks like. So if we do that, it's rendering everything great. And then we open this up. Okay. Look at that. That's awesome. I really like, I don't know. I love creating diagrams, but sometimes I just want like a simple diagram that's easy to represent stuff. And this is great. I love that they added this functionality for data privacy. Wow, I can't even, although now that I think about it, when I did the data privacy, yup, show logo, that's that. Full canvas, viewport only. Oh, this is interesting though. Okay, I'm actually really curious about this because we just saw, okay, that did render. But, okay, as commenting on the user experience design of this, what I was a little surprised though is that if you export as an image, you still have show logo here, viewport only, and this time let's do it as 7. Okay. Oh, I guess that's why they remove it. Fascinating. Because I guess they can't guarantee. Okay, sorry. Let me tell you exactly what's going on in my head. What I found interesting at first, which I didn't realize was the case, is that when you try to export an image, you'll notice there's this option to show the logo. Basically, they give Obsidian credit for helping you generate this diagram, which I like. But a request to the Obsidian team, though, I think it would be great if we made the watermark just a little bit like less visually, like I guess in your face. So more like a watermark, I feel would be good in like just the corner. Like I'd happily put that in because right now, if we take a look at how that looks right now with the full thing, you'll see that the Obsidian here is pretty big. Like it can almost, at least in my mind, it can easily be mistaken as part of this if people aren't careful. So like, again, a clean little watermark on the bottom left, that's almost like opacity grayed out a little bit, I think would basically work perfectly. And I think more people would be happy to include that. So that's an improvement that I think that we could do for the Obsidian Canvas. But that said, you'll notice that when we go to viewport only, we lose a few of the options right there. And so it makes me wonder, like, the way it jumps, if maybe privacy mode should be at the very top because there's this weird Never mind. Ignore me. But anyways, I thought that I wasn't sure whether this logo option impacted the other one because I was like, oh, if I turn it off and leave it on, is it like a preference that's being saved? But clearly it's not. Once you're here, this is the only one that matters, which is the expected behavior. I think either the software developer in me just got curious. So anyhow, okay, very cool. Let's see. I think other than that, granted, there are tons of resources being talked about when it comes to Obsidian Canvas. And so I highly recommend checking out the official docs that we see here. You'll see that there's a bunch of documentation. They talk about different ways you can visualize concepts. I didn't even talk about it, but you can drop images, you can drop websites on here. So a friend of mine had mentioned you could technically run web apps inside of Canvas. And so you can almost organize your own desk. It's bonkers. I'll be playing around with that stuff. And as I come up with useful patterns that I find interesting to me, you'll definitely be hearing about this. But basically, the other thing too is that I want to call out here is that if we, oh, it was here. Let me zoom out. Maybe it's a zoom out issue. You zoom out to 100% and refresh. They had at one point, I'm pretty sure they did. Huh. Okay, if I find it, I'll let you know. But there was a series of videos they were calling out of people who were talking about Obsidian Canvas, but I'll leave that to you to Google on YouTube for those if you want to watch other people do a deeper dive as far as tutorial goes. But I think for me, actually, you know what? Before I do a wrap up, I'll switch over to the main camera. But with that said, I think that takes care of the screen sharing portion. Okay, so with that is a wrap for our very first session of Obsidian Office Hours for 2023. So as a recap, what we did here in this session is we kicked it off with some questions from the audience. We covered the idea of docs versus note-taking and how to prevent the fact that you're duplicating content that's on the internet versus really contextualizing information in a way that's useful for you when it comes to acquiring knowledge and skills. Once again, that's a key piece to that scenario is around the fact that why you're doing the note taking versus if you really are just taking a quick note that you want to reference later, there's nothing wrong with a quick copy paste URL and just moving on. That said, there's also another question regarding other note taking apps that I use. So I went over that as well as some of the context and reasons why I have other note taking apps. And that will certainly be a question I think that we can revisit over time as I continue to refine my own processes and workflow. And then we got to the meat of the opposite, not the meat, or let me go back. And then we got into the topic at hand that I had reserved for this session, which was around Obsidian Canvas. And so we got the ability to talk about what it is, why it's really important, and just a high level like demo of the features. Because I think one of the big things that I've been really thinking about as I've been reflecting on my own journey with content creation and how I want to do things is that frankly, there are a lot of people out there who are doing whether it's Obsidian or honestly any of the topics that I'm interested in, there are a ton of people who are devoted full time to like creating really in-depth tutorials, knowing the ins and outs of everything. And I think they're doing a wonderful job. And I think at one point I found myself trying to like, I guess, copy that approach because I was like, oh, maybe I can teach it in a slightly different way. And what I've come to realize is what I find the most enjoyable about content creation for myself is really about passing on my experience. And again, there is absolutely a niche for educators and out there because I teach myself, I create courses, but especially for the live streams and the kind of stuff that I want to be doing a lot more of this year, I really want it to be more about taking the time to share my own best practices or mistakes that I've made so that you can benefit from those. And then as always, there are official docs and other people who will deep dive on the little things, but and the how-tos. And so for me, I might do some high-level how-tos, but really going forward, you can expect to see me talking about my experience, helping to answer your questions, solve problems that you might be having. I'm happy to do my own spin on how you might have a different scenario and how I might approach a problem. That I'm more than happy to do. And I think that way it'll allow us to veer away from feeling like I'm either regurgitating docs or something, or frankly, like if there is a really good how-to out there, I'll make sure to link out to that because those people are doing phenomenal jobs and I want to be helping to build on the work that they're doing rather than duplicating it. Okay. With that said, it has been an absolute blast, and I'm really glad to be back online. Thanks for everyone who joined live today, and especially for those who asked questions. This is honestly why I do it. Love having the questions and helping to help provide that context. All right, so with that wrap up, thanks again everyone for joining today. If you're looking for the schedule, don't forget you can check out benkozen.io and then scheduling, whether it's you want to follow social media accounts. I've been on Mastodon. That's where I'm trying to do a lot more of my live postings of things. So if you want to get to interact there, check that out. I'll still be posting on Twitter in the meantime, like key announcement, that kind of stuff. But if you do want to follow the live adventure of trying out Mastodon and my experience with that, I'll make sure that social link is included in my website in due time. So, with that said, thanks everyone for joining. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.